In this video, we'll be going over the Unit 7 quiz review. There are 22 questions in total, spread among 4 sections. Let's begin. For this first section, we're going to be converting from degrees to radian measure, or from radian measure to degrees. For the odd problems, 1, 3, and 5, we'll be going from degrees to radians. For these problems, you'll write out what you're starting with. In this case, 17 degrees, negative 88 degrees, and 134 degrees. To go from degrees to radians, you're going to multiply by pi over 180 degrees. So we're going to do that to all 3 here. And the reason this works is because pi and 180 degrees are equivalent. So this is kind of like multiplying by 1, a special one, where we're changing the way that this looks without changing the value of what we have. So in the calculator, I'm going to go 17 over 180, ignoring the pi for now. I'll get some decimal here. And then what you want to do is hit Math, enter for fraction, and then enter again. And this is going to give you 17 over 180. This is the most reduced version of what you can get. So this is 17 pi, we'll put the pi back in, over 180. So 17 degrees converts to 17 pi over 180 radians. Negative 88 divided by, again, ignore the pi, 180. We'll give you this decimal. Math, enter, enter, will be negative 22 over 45. So this is negative 22, put the pi back in, over 45. Lastly, 134 divided by 180, ignoring the pi again, gives you this decimal. Math, enter, enter. So this will be 67, put the pi back in, over 180, or 90. Okay, then to go from radians to degrees, we're going to do something very similar. Let's write out what we have. This will be 9 pi over 4, 7 pi over 15, and 3 pi over 11. This time, to go from radians to degrees, instead of multiplying by pi over 180, we're going to flip that upside down and multiply by 180 degrees over pi. And I'm going to do that to all 3. And what you'll notice is that there's a pi on top and a pi on bottom. We're going to divide those out. And what you're left with is 9 times 180 divided by 4. So in the calculator, just go ahead and put 9 times 180 and then divide by 4. This is 405 degrees. The next one, 7 times 180, divide by 15. This is 84 degrees. And last one for this section, 3 times 180, and divide by 11. So this will be 49.1, we'll round that to, degrees. All right, let's move on to the second section. For the second section, it says for problems 7 through 12, evaluate each trigonometric function without the use of a calculator. So the first section, I did use a calculator here just to convert. In this section, I'll be trying to figure out what sine of 30 degrees, cosine of 45 degrees, and cosine of 7 pi over 6, and so forth are without a calculator. So what that means is I'll be using my unit circle. Here's my unit circle here. To do this, I'm first going to find the angle measure. So 7, 9, and 11 are all using degree measurements. 8, 10, and 12 are using radian measurements. On my unit circle, I've got both here. For example, 30 degrees and pi over 6 are the same. 30 degrees and the radian measure pi over 6 both correlate to this point right here, which is square root of 3 over 2, 1/2. Now this point, this x value, is square root of 3 over 2. That's the same as the cosine of that angle measurement. 1/2 is the y value. That's the same as the sine of that angle measurement. And the tangent is sine divided by cosine, which I've conveniently put on the outside of the circle here. So when I look at sine of 30 degrees, I first find 30 degrees, the point here, and the sine is the y value, so that'll be 1/2. This is 1/2. Cosine of 45 degrees. So I go back to my circle, and I find 45 degrees. There it is. Cosine is the x value, so that'll be the square root of 2 over 2. And the tangent of 240. So I find 240. There it is. And the tangent is on the outside. That'll be the square root of 3. That is sine divided by cosine. So how I got that was taking negative square root of 3 over 2 and dividing by negative 1/2. All right, let's do the same thing, this time in radians. Sine of 5 pi over 3. So first find 5 pi over 3 right here. The sine is the y value, negative square root of 3 over 2. Cosine of 7 pi over 6. So find 7 pi over 6. There it is. Cosine is the x value, another negative square root of 3 over 2. And lastly, tangent of 5 pi over 4. So find 5 pi over 4. There it is. Tangent is on the outside there. That's 1. All right, next section. I'm going to be doing the same thing, evaluating these, but this time I can use a calculator. Okay, so again, 13, 15, 17. The odd ones on the left side, these are in degrees. The right side, these are in radians. Let's start with degrees. I notice that my calculator is currently in radians. So I want to switch this over to degrees in order to do these 3 problems. I'm going to hit mode, go down to where it says radian or degree, select the mode that I want, hit enter. And at the top here, this is changed from radians to degrees. So now I know my calculator is in degrees. I can go ahead and clear this menu. And it's just a matter of putting this in now. The sine of 84 degrees. So sine 84. Let's close this off. This is 0.9945. Cosine of 111 degrees. Cosine 111. Close it off. Enter. This is negative 0.3584. We'll round that to. Tangent of 192 degrees is 0.2126. We'll round that to. So 0.2126. And now we're ready for radians. So let's clear all this. And because these are in radians, again, I'm going to switch my mode. So I'm going to go to mode, go down to radian, enter. My calculator is now in radians, so I can clear the menu. Now, sine 8 pi over 11. So this will be 8 second, find pi over here, and then divide by 11. Close that off and enter. This will be 0.7557. Next one is cosine 5 pi over 7. 5 second pi divided by 7. Okay, we've got negative 0.6235. And lastly, tangent 3 pi over 14. 3 second pi divided by 14. Close that off. This is 0.7975. Okay, that takes care of the front half. Let's go to the back side of this page. For problems 19 through 22, so that'll be the rest of this review, we're going to be using the Pythagorean and tangent identities to solve trigonometric functions. Okay, so 19, I've got find cosine of theta given sine of theta is 0.398, and I've got a restriction here. 0 is less than theta, less than pi over 2. So the first thing I want to do is if I'm finding sine or cosine and I'm given the other, is I want to write down what my Pythagorean identity is. That's sine squared of theta plus cosine squared of theta equals 1. And what I can do here is fill in what I'm given. So I'm given the sine of theta is 0.398. So if this is sine squared of theta, then I can plug in 0.398 here and say that this is the sine of theta. So I'm going to square this to be sine squared of theta plus cosine squared of theta equals 1. So in the calculator, let's find out what that is. 0.398. And let's square that. Okay, so this is 0.158404. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this whole thing here. I'm going to try not to round until the end so that my answer can be as precise as possible. So this is sine squared of theta. So now plus cosine squared of theta equals 1. Let's subtract this from both sides. So that'll subtract out on the left side, leaving cosine squared of theta is equal to, on the right side, this will be 1 minus this 0.158404. That's going to be 0.841596. Now I'm trying to find cosine. This is cosine squared. So let's take the square root. Of course, when I take the square root on the left here, the square root of something squared will just be that thing. So this will be cosine of theta is equal to, now when I take the square root, because theta is unknown, it's a variable here, I'm going to do plus or minus. And then now, square root of that is 0.841596 will give me, and then at this point we can round to maybe 4 digits after the decimal. So 0.9174. Now the problem here is that there are two possible solutions. Cosine of theta could be positive 0.9174, but it could be negative 0.9174. In order to find out whether it should be positive or negative, I'm going to take a look at my restriction. My restriction is 0 is less than theta less than pi over 2. So if I go to my unit circle, 0 is right here, pi over 2 is right here, and I am saying that this angle has to be between these two. 0 is less than theta less than pi over 2. Well, in between these two, all of the cosine values, these are the x values here, are positive 1/2, positive square root of 2 over 2, positive square root of 3 over 2. So this tells me that while I don't know the angle itself, I can say the cosine of this angle must be positive between 0 and pi over 2. So this will be cosine of theta is positive 0.9174. All right, number 20. We're essentially going to follow the same steps here. Let's start with the Pythagorean identity. Sine squared of theta plus cosine squared of theta equals 1. This time we're given cosine instead of sine, but it's pretty much the same thing. We're just going to plug in here for cosine rather than for sine. So this will be sine squared of theta plus, now instead of cosine squared, we're going to do cosine is 0.984. So 0.984 squared. This is going to be equal to 1. In the calculator, we will find 0.984 and square that. So now I've got sine squared of theta plus 0.968256. This is equal to 1. And just like before, we're going to subtract this from both sides. So that'll subtract out on the left side, leaving sine squared of theta. This will be equal to 1 minus 0.968256. So I'm left with 0.031744. Now this is sine squared. I'm looking for sine. So let's take the square root. Sine of theta is equal to plus or minus, and now we can round here, 0.1782. Again, to determine whether my sine of theta this time should be positive or negative, I'm going to look at my restriction. That says 3 pi over 2 is less than theta, less than 2 pi. So I go back to my unit circle again. And 3 pi over 2 is right here. And 2 pi will bring me all the way back to where I started. So I'm between these two in this bottom right-hand quadrant. And I am looking at the sine values. These are the y values. The y values for these are negative square root of 3 over 2, negative square root of 2 over 2, and negative 1/2. This tells me that while I don't know the actual angle, theta, I can say the sine of theta must be negative. So the sine of theta is negative 0.1782. All right, 21. This time I'm looking for sine and cosine. I'm given tangent of theta instead, 6.653, and then some restriction, 0 is less than theta, less than pi over 2. So in this case, when I'm given the tangent, I'm going to use the fact that tangent is sine over cosine. And let's start with that. Tangent of theta equals sine of theta over cosine of theta. Well, what I can do here is I can multiply both sides by cosine of theta. Have that divide out, and I'm left with sine of theta on this side is equal to tangent of theta, and I multiply that by cosine of theta. And if I know the tangent, I can go ahead and plug that in here. The sine of theta is equal to 6.653 is tangent of theta, cosine of theta. Now, sine is this whole thing. It's this 6.653 cosine of theta. So now I'm going to bring this into my Pythagorean identity. And I say sine squared of theta plus cosine squared of theta is equal to 1. Well, I can substitute sine squared of theta for 6.653 cosine of theta, that squared. So plugging in 6.653 cosine of theta squared plus cosine squared of theta, this is equal to 1. So what this really means is 6.653, I'm going to square that, and then I'm going to square my cosine. So 6.653, let's square that. This is 44.262409. So I've got 44.262409, and then cosine squared will be cosine squared of theta. Now I'm adding another cosine squared of theta here, and it's equal to 1. So if I've got 44 point some cosine squared, and I'm adding another cosine squared, well, that's just going to be 45.262409 cosine squareds. and that's equal to 1. Let's divide by this coefficient. So we're going to divide by 45.262409. That'll give me cosine squared of theta is equal to 1 divided by 45.262409, 0.02209. Finally, I'm ready to take the square root here. And I'll get the cosine of theta is positive or negative 0.1486. To tell, just like the other two, the last two problems, whether this should be positive or negative, I'm going to bring up my unit circle. And I look at my restriction. 0 is less than theta, less than pi over 2. So 0 is here, pi over 2 is here. This tells me to look at the cosines here, and that's 1/2, square root of 2 over 2, square root of 3 over 2. These are all positive, and therefore my cosine for this theta must be positive. Cosine of theta is 0.1486. Now you might think I'm out of room here and I've still got to find sine of theta. But remember, all the way back here, we had sine of theta is equal to tangent of theta times cosine of theta. We were given tangent is 6.653. And now we've found cosine. So if sine of theta is equal to tangent of theta times cosine of theta, I can just multiply those two together. That'll be 6.653 multiplied to the cosine that I just found is 0.1486. So the sine of theta is 0.9886. All right, let's do one more problem, just like this one. I've got find the values of sine of theta and cosine of theta. I'm given tangent of theta is this time negative 9.366, and my restriction is pi over 2 is less than theta, less than pi. All right, just like before, let's begin with sine of theta is equal to tangent of theta times cosine of theta. I found that earlier from tangent is sine over cosine and multiplying both sides by the cosine. And we'll plug in what we know. We know the tangent of theta is negative 9.366. So we'll say the sine of theta is equal to negative 9.366 cosine of theta. And then we go to our Pythagorean identity. Sine squared of theta plus cosine squared of theta, this is equal to 1. And since I know sine of theta is this whole thing, negative 9.366 cosine of theta, I can plug that in for sine here. That'll be negative 9.366 cosine of theta that thing squared plus cosine squared of theta is equal to 1. In the calculator, I'll square this negative 9.366. Careful, I'm going to use parentheses here. Negative 9.366. Close that off and then square it, because I want the calculator to note that this is negative before I square it. If I don't use the parentheses, it'll square it and then make it negative afterwards, which is not what I want. So negative 9.366 squared is going to be 87.721956. So this will be 87.721956 cosine squared of theta, because I'm also squaring this cosine, plus another cosine squared. This is equal to 1. Now I've got 87 point some cosine squareds. I'm adding another cosine squared. So this will be 88.721956 cosine squareds. This will be equal to 1, and then I want to divide by that coefficient. All right, almost there. We've got cosine squared of theta is equal to 1 divided by 88.721956. This will be 0.01127. And finally, let's take the square root. I've got cosine of theta is equal to positive or negative. Square root of this is 0.1062. To determine whether it should be positive or negative, let's take a look at the restriction. Pi over 2 is less than theta, less than pi. So I find pi over 2 is right here, and then pi is right here. So I'm between pi over 2 and pi. In this section, cosine, which is what we're looking for, is negative 1/2, negative square root of 2 over 2, and negative square root of 3 over 2. So this tells me that my cosine must be negative. Cosine of theta is negative 0.1062. And then to find the sine, sine of theta is tangent of theta times cosine of theta. I was given the tangent earlier. That is negative 9.366. And I'm going to multiply to the cosine that I just found, negative 0.1062. And that'll give me the sine of theta is positive 0.9947. That is the whole quiz review. Your quiz will be just like this. Study up. If you have any questions, please let me know.